My lady, I think, sorry, before the witness is sworn, there was a couple of small housekeeping matters. Should I deal with those first?
Well, as First Minister standing up, you carry on with the oath. Oops, sorry, throwing my pen at you.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to help again.
Good morning.
Ms Dobbin, housekeeping.
My lady, if I deal with those two small housekeeping matters. First of all, you might recollect last week that you weren't able to hear evidence from Mr. Conor Murphy, and that was pending the results of some medical tests. And I said on behalf of the inquiry that we would revisit this with you. The inquiry has received an update from Mr. Murphy's legal representatives and a copy of a doctor's letter. And by this update, the inquiry has been informed that he's undergone further medical treatment and that he's been advised that he should rest for 2 weeks pending further advice. So we wanted to update you that that was the position and seek your agreement that we could inform Mr. Murphy that in these circumstances he would be excused attending this public hearing to give evidence. If you were agreeable to that course, we would respectfully request that his witness statement is published on the inquiry website after this hearing has concluded, and we'll give some thought again on behalf of the inquiry to whether he might be asked to give evidence at some point in the future, or consider whether or not his statement, of course with other evidence that you've heard in Module 2C, satisfactorily covers the issues that the inquiry would have investigated or asked Mr. Murphy questions about. But I think the first issue is whether or not you're content to adopt that course.
I am. Thank you, Ms Dobbin. We'll come back to whether or not we need to hear from Mr. Murphy at a later date.
And the second matter that arises is that when the inquiry published the timetable, I think it was the timetable for this week, it omitted to mention or to specify when former Assistant Chief Constable Todd would be giving evidence. It was always intended that he give evidence, but he was missed for the timetable for tomorrow. I think that has been rectified on the public timetable that's published on the website, but I thought it was important this morning just to draw that to your attention, that there had been that omission, but that he will be appearing tomorrow.
And I think it's in the afternoon slot.
That's correct, my lady. He is scheduled for after Baroness Foster.
Thank you very much.
My lady, may I call then the first witness, or the only witness for today? Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Michelle O'Neill.
Miss O'Neill, you ought to have 2 witness statements in front of you. I think you should have a first witness statement that you signed on the 12th of March 2024. And I think you signed that statement at page 106.
That's correct.
And are you content that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I am.
And you ought to have a much shorter second statement in front of you, which you signed on the 15th of March 2024, signed at page 10.
Yes, that's correct.
And again, Miss O'Neill, are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, that's correct.
Miss O'Neill, turning first then, if I may, to your background, I think it's right that you've been a member of the Legislative Assembly for the Mid-Ulster constituency since 2007.
Yes, that's right.
During that time, you were Minister for Agriculture and Rural Development for a period. Yes.
Correct. Yeah.
And you were also the Minister for Health for a period between May 2016 and March 2017.
That's right.
Is that also correct? And you were the Deputy First Minister from the 11th of January to the 4th of February 2022.
That's correct.
So you were in position for the period of time that this inquiry is most concerned with, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And it's also right to say that since the resumption of power sharing just a short time ago, you're now the First Minister for Northern Ireland,
I am,
correct? And I think in addition to all of that, it's right that you remain the Vice President of the Sinn Féin party as well. Is that
correct.
also correct? And is that a national role, Miss O'Neill?
It is.
So is it, sorry, when I say that, is it a role in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or is it just in respect of the North?
Across the island of
Northern
Ireland.
Thank you. Turning then to the period that this inquiry is most concerned with. You were the joint head of government in Northern Ireland, correct?
That's correct.
You were jointly responsible for leading the response of the government in Northern Ireland to the pandemic.
That's
correct. And leading is the critical descriptor, isn't it? You weren't just a convener of the executive committee or an administrator of that committee. You were a leader of ministers, correct?
A leader of the executive in our particularly unique circumstance of government, yes.
But you were a leader of ministers.
A leader
yes.
of the executive, yes.
And when it came to the pandemic, you were leading a response which goes to the most solemn of all government responsibilities, weren't you?
That's correct.
That of the protection of the people in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And do you accept that?
Yes.
And do you accept that leadership involves inculcating the ethos and the values that you would wish other ministers to display as well?
Yes.
And do you accept that that's all the more so during a period of national emergency or during a pandemic?
Of course.
And do you consider that you and the ministers of Northern Ireland provided the leadership to the people of Northern Ireland that they deserved during the pandemic?
Yes, I do. And if you want, I'll elaborate further on that, if that's okay. The backdrop to the Assembly and Executive being restored was public services being decimated with 10 years of austerity cuts, health service on its knees. We didn't have functioning government for 3 years prior to that. Ministers were just back around the executive table on the 11th of January, just a short number of weeks before the pandemic really took hold. And I believe the public were best served by having locally elected ministers around the executive table, albeit, and I know we'll interrogate this throughout the course of today, albeit not always perfect, but I do believe that every executive party around that table were there to do their best. They were there to save lives. They were there to work together as best we could. And they were there to deal with an unprecedented global pandemic that none of us had ever experienced before, even though there were varying degrees of experience within the executive itself. I think it's fair to say that no government had faced this type of global emergency before, and we were all in new territory. But I genuinely believe that the public here were best served by having those locally elected ministers in place.
Well, the question wasn't about whether or not they were best served, Ms O'Neill, it was whether or not you and the ministers of Northern Ireland provided people in Northern Ireland with the leadership that they deserved. That was the question.
Yes, I believe that we did.
And do you think that you provided them with the leadership that they deserved during the pandemic?
Yes, I do.
Well, perhaps we'll look at that a little bit more closely. Ms O'Neill, I was going to start, if I may, with some messages between you and Baroness Foster from the 21st of March. Perhaps if I could ask for those to be brought up on screen. That's INQ 000 400 592. It's the 21st of March, Miss O'Neill. And do you agree that the pandemic or the threat that Northern Ireland faced had crystallised by this point and that things were in a very difficult position?
Yes, I do. By the 21st of March, yes.
And I think that we can see here that Baroness Foster was accusing you of having publicly undermined the Health Minister, pointing out that if you wanted to effect a change in policy, you were going about it completely the wrong way, that you were playing politics when things were much too serious, and that it was hugely disappointing. But she says, unfortunately, I'm not surprised, correct?
That's her statement, yes.
And you go on to say it's too serious to tolerate incompetence. Things are too slow. Lives will be lost. Start listening. Yes?
Yes.
And Baroness Foster goes on to say, I hope you're not calling two of your ministerial colleagues incompetent. Naomi and Robin have both raised concerns about your behaviour. You need to be more collegiate. Yes?
Yes.
And then you go on to say the department is not serving Robin well. We're not being served well by the civil service. Yes?
Yes.
And you go on to say our nurses are crying out for help to do their jobs. Yes?
Yes.
That can be taken down. Thank you. We see in embryonic form, don't we, in that exchange, Miss O'Neill, a number of the issues that played out during the pandemic. Do you agree?
I think that, yes, I think it reflects the difficulty that we were facing, I suppose the scale of the challenge that we're facing, the difficulties that we had internally within the system. And that particular period is reflecting the aftermath of the issue around school closures and the discussions that we had around how we were served in terms of the medical advice that we were receiving. I don't think it reflects, I don't think it reflects probably any difference that probably most governments around the world would have been experienced in terms of how they thought that we should deal with the pandemic. And given the uncertainty and the unprecedented nature of it, I would imagine that these were not unique to ourselves in terms of how we were trying to manage and get through it. But that particular exchange is in a context to a particular issue of school closures.
I think I meant something rather different, Miss O'Neill. The allegation of playing politics, that is something, isn't it, that we see throughout the course of 2020 and into 2021 by you and your colleagues. Do you agree?
As in all of the executive colleagues?
A number of your executive colleagues, including you, at points in time throughout 2020.
No, I absolutely refute that. I don't accept that I played politics. I accept that the severity of the situation reflected my attention. The severity of the situation in terms of trying to find consensus around an executive table around an issue which was so serious, such as school closures, meant that I tried my very best to try to find that consensus within the executive. That was not forthcoming, and the issue was far too serious to sit back and say nothing.
All right. Well, I'm not just talking about the school closures, Miss O'Neill, but we'll examine how a number of difficult issues were dealt with by you and your colleagues. But just coming back to what this exchange might encapsulate, does it not also encapsulate dysfunction, that this was the way that you and Baroness Foster communicated with each other about these most serious of issues, that it's reduced to this kind of WhatsApp conversation between you?
But of course, this was a conversation between ourselves, not supposed to be played out in public. It expresses the difficulty that we were having at that time, and at different times throughout the pandemic we had a difference of approach. That's not politicking. That's about what's the right way and what's the wrong way. And in my opinion, at that time, the approach being adopted, and I think that some of the minutes of previous exchanges between CMO, the head of the civil service, etc., they were pushing back in terms of what I was advocating, which was for us to act faster, and felt that we were overreaching into health. And I think the First Minister then got behind that approach also, and that then led to that difficulty.
Yeah, I meant rather more the nature of the conversation or the discourse between you conveyed in these messages. It's hardly mature discussion between two leaders, is it?
It was the nature of the difficulty of the circumstance. Arlene and I probably agreed on quite a lot of things throughout the pandemic. This demonstrates one exchange at one point in time. And as I said, I refute the allegation of playing politics. This was about saving lives and what I thought was the right thing to do.
And does that explain your lack of collectivity at this point? The fact that you were speaking out against other ministers, again, at this crucial and sensitive period for Northern Ireland?
Well, if you may, I'd like to put it in some context. The pandemic was rapidly developing. People were watching the unfolding scenes across the world. Internationally, what was happening in China, Italy and elsewhere. We're in mid-March at this stage. People are very alarmed. People are watching the approach of the British government in London. At this stage, we've had Cheltenham go ahead. We've had Atletico Madrid soccer game, go ahead. Large crowds were gathering. People had made up their own mind that the Boris Johnson government approach was too slow. It was incongruous to what the WHO were advocating, what ECDC were advocating, and at that very same time, we also had a situation where school closures had happened in the other part of this island, in the south, and parents couldn't understand what the difference was, and I tried to interrogate the difference in approach, but I couldn't be satisfied that the approach that was being advocated, because our CMO was obviously following the approach of SAGE, and the advice that was coming from London, to me, was fundamentally flawed. I tried to interrogate that. I tried to get the right decision in the executive, and I know that you yourself have interrogated some of that evidence, particularly in relation to the pushback that I got from the head of the civil service, that I was moving ahead of the science, the pushback that we got from the CMO and the health minister to say that this was not the right time to move.
If I can,
But we had, if I just finish just briefly. But we also were in danger of losing the room. People were voting with their feet. Parents had already chosen to take their children out of school. The Catholic bishops had come out and asked schools to close. The public confidence in our ability to lead from that very early time was being diminished, and I was trying to recapture that. Is it ideal to do it outside of the executive? No, it's not. Preferably, as I did, I tried to change the position from within. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And within a matter of 2 days, the British government changed their approach, and the CMO then changed the approach and advice here. Nothing had changed to when I advocated that position.
So, Ms
2
O'Neill,
days previous.
forgive me, I didn't mean to speak over you. I am actually going to come back and look
Sure.
over all of
Sorry.
this in much more detail about what was being said at that point in time. So I didn't want to cut you off,
Sorry.
because we are going to come back to it and deal with it in more detail. I just wanted to focus on the themes, perhaps,
Sure.
that might be seen, as I've said, an embryo in those exchanges. But blaming others, that's something that you have done throughout your witness statement, isn't it? I mean, your second witness statement to this inquiry. The constant theme throughout it, do you agree, is that you blame the UK government for the slowness of its approach in the initial stages of the pandemic. Do you agree?
I don't accept that I blame others throughout the statement. I accept that I point out where I think things were wrong, and in particular, I do believe that my position's vindicated in terms of the fact that Boris Johnson and his government were too slow to act at the start of the pandemic.
I just want to go, if I can, please, to your 12th of March statement. If we could go, please, to page 98 and to paragraph 383. I'm just going to take this from the outset, Miss O'Neill, what you've set out there. That it's a reality that as the pandemic progressed, the approach of the Tory government to the pandemic was not consistent with the approach by the executive. As I've acknowledged, we were largely aligned with the UK for the reasons I have explained. But as the pandemic progressed, we did adopt a more localised response, which responded to the realities of the pandemic in the north. The approach of the Tory government to the pandemic is in many ways epitomised by the evidence which has emerged of partying in number 10 Downing Street in breach of the regulations introduced to protect the public from the pandemic. Staff parties of the type which are now a matter of public knowledge did not occur in our local context and would frankly have been unthinkable. I believe it's emblematic of the failure of the Johnson administration to appropriately engage with and respond to the gravity of the pandemic and its impact on the lives of those we are elected to represent. Ms O'Neill, there's no reflection, I don't think, nor any insight in your witness statement about any of the hurt or any of the problems that you caused by attending the funeral of Mr. Storey. Do you agree?
I think I have addressed that in my statement and in previous statements, but if you allow me, I'd be happy to address it right now.
Certainly.
Sure, thank you. And maybe perhaps even to go directly to the families, because it's those people that have been impacted by my actions, and if that's okay, I would like to address them.
I'm afraid, Ms O'Neill, you're here to give evidence, not to address people. I think you need to give your evidence.
You're basically addressing me.
Okay, sorry, my lady. I mean, I have to say up front, and I do want to direct, I'm glad that we're actually able to speak about this so early on in the evidence, because there is no doubt that the families themselves have been through an experience that there is no coming back from. It's been absolutely horrendous, and to lose loved ones in a way in which they have has been just absolutely horrendous. I have met some of the families individually. I have equally listened to some of the testimony the testimony that was offered at the start of the inquiry. And no family should ever have to go through what these families have went through. I also know equally that my actions compounded the hurt and that horrible experience that those families have went through. I also know that my actions also angered the families, and for that I'm truly sorry. I am sorry for going, and I'm sorry for the hurt that's been caused after that. And I want to make that statement very clear on the record again today.
Did you realise at the time the hurt and anger that going to the funeral would cause?
I didn't, but I ought to have.
Could we bring up on screen, please, INQ 000 474 208, please? These are the minutes of the meeting that took place after the funeral with your executive colleagues. And you addressed them at, well, from the bottom of page 1. And if we go over the page, I think you invite your colleagues to divorce their views of Mr. Story from your actions, that you were invited by the family, that you were honoured to do so. Huge figure, knew thousands would wish to attend. Online streaming, watched by 250,000 people. If I go down that a little bit, people entitled to view, people vote with feet. Applause along the Andersonstown Road. No dilution in my mind of public message. No offence intended. And if we go on, please, to look at page 7. Mr. Murphy's not been able to give evidence, but in terms of what he said, rules relaxed, not same circumstances, technicalities. He sets out a bit about his attendance. And then over the page, people can say what they want to say, entitled to opinion. I'm entitled to be sceptical. You were entirely unapologetic on the 2nd of July, weren't you?
So I think that I have reflected there. I think I would go further than what I said in that minute. It was immediately after the funeral itself, and I think what I've said there in terms of not diluting the public message, that was wrong, because clearly I did, and I have acknowledged that. And equally, I've worked every day ever since to regain public confidence and trust. I think I took every opportunity that I had in terms of the aftermath in both the Assembly chamber, in front of the Scrutiny committee. I've said it publicly on a number of occasions about how sorry I am, and I am absolutely from the bottom of my heart sorry, because I would never, ever set out to hurt people.
Can I just ask, in relation to your witness statement, when you made your witness statement, you made the criticisms of Boris Johnson's government and the allegations of partying in Downing Street, wasn't that a bit hypocritical, knowing what you knew by the time you made that statement?
I don't think so, because they're two very different things in terms of the Boris Johnson approach of partying the whole way through the pandemic and drinking their way through it, to be quite blunt.
Well, we didn't find out about the partying until after the pandemic. I mean, what you did was to do something that the bereaved couldn't do, the normal bereaved couldn't do, because you wanted to go to a friend's funeral. Isn't that then saying that what Boris Johnson's government did was wrong, is a bit hypocritical?
No, I don't think so, because what I did under the understanding of the regulations at that time, and I know we don't want to open that up, my lady, but I have answered to that. But I do accept wholeheartedly that I, in some way, damaged our executive relations with colleagues who had been working very hard with me the whole way through. I also accept wholeheartedly that I damaged the public health messaging, and I had work to do to regain that. But I did that. I worked hard to regain that trust and confidence and to lead us for the next year and a half through the pandemic.
So the only reason I'm pressing on the statement is the point of principle is that those who set the rules should obey the rules both in spirit and in the letter. That's really the point I'm making.
Yeah, and I should have anticipated the outworking of what I did.
Sorry to interrupt.
Was it really that difficult to anticipate the outworking of what you did, Miss O'Neill?
It was, insofar as as far as I was concerned, on a personal invite, attending a cortege of 30 people. And I tried not to open this up, but just that's the basis on which I attended. But I've said it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what it did. I should have, anticipated the fallout. I should have anticipated what would happen in the aftermath. And that's why I've worked hard to try to regain that confidence and trust. And equally, and more importantly, I think it's about all of the families of bereaved and people who went through a horrific circumstance and the experience that they've had. It's just horrendous, and I would never set out to try to compound that or in any way make it more difficult for them to deal with their grief.
One of the first questions I asked you was whether or not people from Northern Ireland got the leadership that they deserved from you. How can you maintain that they did in light of what you've just accepted?
Because I didn't say that everything was perfect all of the time. I do believe that I did lead from the front the whole way through the pandemic, as did all of my executive colleagues. We've had difficulties, we've had challenging times, we've worked through very difficult times, which I'm sure you'll want to speak about. But I do believe that I led the whole way through, albeit I've put my hands up in terms of the funeral itself and how I shouldn't have done that, because that took away from all of the work that I had put into trying to lead us through the pandemic, which was hard on everybody right across society. We were faced as an executive with hugely difficult, challenging decisions to take, and I worked day and night to get us through this pandemic. So apart from this one time, I do believe that my leadership was strong through the pandemic.
All right, well, let's examine that. I wanted to start, and I wanted to go really to those first months of the pandemic in order to understand what government in Northern Ireland was doing to respond. And I wanted to start with what you say about this in your witness statement, please. And if we could go, please, to page 9, paragraph 29. And I've gone to paragraph 29 just to orientate us in time. So this was the 25th of February. And I'll come back to that strategic review, Miss O'Neill. But just looking at paragraph 30 and what you say there, at this time, so that's the time period that you're talking about, the Department of Health remained the lead department in responding to the predicted global pandemic. TEO staff had stood up CCG, and I am going to come back to that, and were involved in official level meetings from the 20th of February. And then you set out a submission that you received, and I'm going to go to that. But you say this: the CCG structures were still operating at an official level, as Department of Health officials had not yet activated NICMA arrangements in line with established civil contingency protocols. At this point in time, and as the civil contingency arrangements were still operating at a proprietary and official level, the Executive Committee had no direct role in overseeing the response. However, ministers were being briefed and were ready to step in as and when needed. I think a number of points arise from paragraph 30. First of all, it wasn't for Department of Health officials to activate NICMA, was it?
Well, I believe it was, because they were, in terms of the lead department, and all correspondence that we'd received to that point made it very clear that health were the lead department. And I also believe that some of the information you've explored points to the fact that health were resisting NICMA being stood up and hadn't indicated that we were at the stage yet where that would be helpful.
We're going to take this one step at a time.
Sure.
And I'm going to ask you to perhaps base your answers on what you understood at the time as opposed to evidence that you've heard in this inquiry. Looking at what you've said, the structures were still operating at an official level as Department of Health officials had not yet activated NICMA arrangements. Are you familiar with the 2016 protocol for civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland?
Yes, I am.
Then you will know that it was completely within your powers or those of the Executive Office to be able to activate those arrangements. Do you agree?
Well, I think, again, in context, I think we have to be very clear that all advice was very clear. And we remember we have no other specialised advice. It all sat within the Department of Health. We were told by the head of the civil service, by everybody that we engaged with, any correspondence we had, that health were the lead department, and that at that point they were leading the charge, if you like, in terms of our response. It's only slightly further down past the February date, towards the end of February, where it starts to become very clear that we need to move towards the NICMA arrangements being stood up. And I think that, forgive me, but it's hard not to reflect on some of the evidence that you have referred to throughout the course of the inquiry. It's very clear that we were being resisted in terms of setting up NICMA because health were the lead department. However, I do think that on reflection, that it's very clear that given the resistance that we had from health because they felt that perhaps we were overreaching or interfering in their area of work, that there needs to be, or the ability to stand up NICMA earlier perhaps could have been much more beneficial in terms of other departments being able to come together in a more unified way earlier on.
I'm not quite at the point of asking for reflection, Miss O'Neill. Do you accept that under the 2016 arrangements, you had the power, you and the First Minister had the power to stand up the central or the civil contingencies arrangements for Northern Ireland Government?
Well, I think it's a matter of fact that, yes, we could have, but it's also equally a matter of fact that the Department of Health were in the lead and advising against it. I had no other alternative view, and officials weren't bringing forward recommendations as to that we should, this is the advice from officials, that we should move forward with this at this time. I think there was a roundly accepted view within the system of the civil service that health were in the lead, and it was the understanding of ourselves that health was in the lead and would indicate to us whenever they needed to move beyond the health alone front and move into that wider civil contingency space.
Can you help me as to when you were advised, and I'm talking about a point in time, when you were advised by the Department of Health that you shouldn't set up the civil contingencies arrangements or that they weren't required?
I will have to just check the date, but I'm very clear that from very early on that we were being told from from the 30th of January from Bernie Rooney to TEO that health were in the lead. We were being told on the 15th of February that health were in the lead. We were told on the 3rd of March from the Civil Contingencies Policy Branch that health were in the lead. So we had no reason to go counter to that at that stage. However, by the 3rd of March, it was becoming clear that it needed to be much wider than a health response. And I think that's where you can start to see the change in terms of pace and the work that was done across civil contingencies then.
Just because health were in the lead, that didn't negate the fact that you and the First Minister were the joint leaders of the Northern Ireland Government. Do you agree?
It was a health pandemic and we were being very much guided by health, and there are times when you can see that Chief Medical Officer's advice was that they didn't need the NICMA structures, that it would actually interfere with the work that they are doing. And I had no other advice to counter that, and that was the difficulty. I think
it must have been very apparent to you early on, Miss O'Neill, that this was more than a health pandemic and that it would raise serious issues for the whole of Northern Ireland.
It, of course, became increasingly clear that it was going to become much wider, but we were only in the executive from the middle of January. We were getting brief from the head of the civil service. We had these developments that I've just referred to over the course of those weeks. So it was becoming increasingly clear, of course, over time that we needed that wider structure, which is why we moved to that point in early March.
Can you help us then with what you also say at paragraph 30? The Executive Committee had no direct role in overseeing the response.
Yeah,
Sorry, first of all,
sorry.
is that up and until the 20th of February?
yes,
had
because it was
no
being led
role?
by the Department of Health.
So again, is your evidence to this inquiry that you and the Executive Committee had effectively left this to the Department of Health?
Absolutely
That
not.
you had no responsibility for it?
No, I didn't say that. What I'm referring to is that the Department of Health were the lead department in terms of preparedness. We were being told that in all of our advice and all of our exchanges that we had with either the Hawks or the Department of Health itself, the Minister or CMO. What was very clear is that they were in the lead, and despite at different times us asking for what else we needed to be doing in terms of that wider cross-departmental response, the view of health was that it was too soon, it would interrupt their work, and I had no other advice to counter that, so that was the difficulty that we had. However, it's just beyond this time that I think that you can start to see the pace of things change in terms of the standing up of the civil contingencies.
So I want to just stick with this for a moment. The Executive Committee had no direct role in overseeing the response. You must accept, though, that the Executive Committee had direct responsibility for overseeing the response.
Yeah, I think that it's important, again, to say that all the advice that we were given, both myself and Arling, was that the Department of Health were in the lead and that we shouldn't disrupt the work that they were doing. That being said, at this stage we had been briefed on the 3rd of February, I think the 10th of February, we were continually engaged with the preparedness work and what was actually happening. We were having conversations with Health and with the head of the Civil Service. But very clearly, shortly after that time, that's whenever civil contingencies kicked in.
I think the question permits of a yes or no answer. Did the Executive Committee have responsibility for the response to the pandemic up and until the 20th of February?
The Executive Committee, it was the Department of Health who were in the lead.
That's not an answer. They may have been in the
Well,
lead.
then, no, the Department of Health were in the lead.
Are you saying that the Executive Committee did not have responsibility, the overarching responsibility, Miss O'Neill, for the response to the pandemic up and until the 20th of February?
I think you've explored some of the unique nature, my lady, of our political apparatus and how we're established. We're a product of a peace agreement in 1998. We have a very siloed mentality, departmental structure. There is ministerial autonomy in terms of what a minister can do. There is legalities around overreaching into other ministers' responsibilities. And I think you too have expressed some concern about, and on reflection and having come through the pandemic, I shared this view that there needs to be some sort of emergency ability to step in and to change that structure, at least temporarily, for the period of a pandemic or another unpredicted circumstance such as that, because, as has been explained, the Executive Office and the role of First and Deputy First Minister, whilst it has a coordinating role for the Executive, the problem is that you cannot direct other ministers to do certain things. Even the head of the Civil Service, because of the unique circumstance, can't direct other permanent secretaries to do certain things. So that makes, I think, the response to a pandemic or some other circumstances quite difficult in terms of our own system of governance. So I just wanted to put that in that context.
I think we understand that, Miss O'Neill, and I think the inquiry has seen evidence that the way departments operate and their legal position may cause this siloing or compartmentalisation. But that's not really the question that I'm asking you. I think the question that's being asked is a far, far more fundamental one. And it's whether or not you accept that there was a collective responsibility which you were leading for the response to the pandemic up and until the 20th of February.
Well, Let me say, of course, I accept that we have a collective responsibility to lead and to get us through the pandemic. But at this point, up until this time, the Department of Health were the lead department, operating all the preparatory work, responding to the pandemic as they were instructed by SAGE in terms of the influenza approach. They were very, very much in the lead. However, at this stage also, CCG staff had been working to start to coordinate that work across departmental. And then it came to the attention of ourselves, myself and Arling, in the briefing of the 3rd of March. That was the time in which we had to officially kick in, and that's where we became the holder, if you like, of the direction of overseeing the response.
Well, I think you have accepted somewhere in that answer that there was responsibility. But just coming back to your repeated reference to the fact that the Department of Health were the lead department, again, just to be clear about this, to make sure that we're proceeding on a common understanding, the fact that there's a lead department in a response to a national emergency, it does not obviate, does it, the responsibility, the collective responsibility that the Executive Committee had for the response to the pandemic?
No, I think that that's correct insofar as the Department of Health were in the lead, but at the right juncture, after we'd been receiving considerable pushback, we did get to the point where we had CCG stood up, and the whole of the executive was then, in terms of the approach to the whole executive was working together in terms of the CCG response.
But Ms O'Neill, what about oversight, collective oversight of what the Department of Health was doing? What about scrutiny? What about seeking detailed plans and detailed understanding of what was being done on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland in order to respond to the pandemic? That was the collective responsibility, wasn't it?
And that did happen.
When did that happen?
That happened from very early on, from our first meeting of the Health Minister on the 3rd of February, I believe, is the date that he brought it first officially to the Executive. Then at every meeting after that is where we would have had the opportunity to ask questions, probe the information that was coming forward, interrogate the advice that was coming forward. And that happened, I think, well, that happened certainly from that 3rd of February when it was first brought to the Executive. So I suppose that's where the collective conversations and approach started to develop.
Well, I'm glad we've located where that scrutiny took place, and we'll obviously go to the minutes and examine that. I wanted to go, though, to a briefing that you received. If we could bring up, please, INQ 000 391 226. This was a briefing that was prepared for you, and it was after the first COBRA meeting. Or sorry, it wasn't. It was after the second COBRA meeting that took place in January, correct?
Yes.
And if we could go over the page, please. Thank you. And to the next page, please, to paragraph 2. We can see reference to the fact that the level of risk was due to increase to moderate. Yes?
Yes.
It does go on to say, in practical terms, this makes little or no difference, but rather reflects the increase in spread of the virus. Health officials will continue to undertake the same precautionary measures and levels of preparedness. Did you challenge in any way the advice that you were being provided with in this briefing to you, or did you seek to ascertain what the change in risk signified?
I don't have that absolute recollection, but I would be fairly certain that I would have. We would have asked questions, no doubt, whenever we receive a submission like this. And again, I do recall at that point, again, the point being made about the Department of Health being the lead, and they continue to take the same precautionary measure and level of preparedness.
So if we go down then, thank you, that can come down, and just look at what you were being told. the current situation was, and look particularly at the first two bullet points after 4. So we can see that you were being told that it was spreading throughout China and globally. We can see that you were being told that it could be asymptomatic and that it could range from a mild illness to pneumonia, correct?
Yes.
And if we go to page 4, paragraph 7. So all devolved administrations to review reasonable worst case pandemic plans for preparedness, correct?
Yes.
And if we go please to page 7 in paragraph 1. And it's yes, thank you. It's that paragraph 1 that refers to those who are elderly and who have existing health conditions being disproportionately affected. Yes?
Yes.
And then it refers to the COBRA again, to reasonable worst case scenario planning as set out in slide 9 of CRIP 2. And would you have had the CRIP as well sitting alongside these minutes? I think that we've heard that they were provided to the TEO.
I couldn't honestly say that we did have the CRIP at that stage. I'm fairly certain we would have as an addendum to the paper, but I'm not fully certain.
All right, that can come down, thank you. Do you accept, Miss O'Neill, that by the 30th of January you had been provided with quite a lot of information that indicated just how serious the picture was becoming about the spread of COVID-19 and the risks that it presented?
By the 30th of January, I was observing for myself what was happening internationally.
Yes.
By the 30th of January, that's the first official submission that has come in to myself and to the First Minister at the time. And it's from that point that we're engaged, because that was the preamble, if you like, to the Health Minister then presenting to the first executive meeting on the 3rd, 4 days later. And that was what would informed the briefing that was given. And also it equally informed the CMO at that stage, then sent a memo out to all departments around that reasonable worst case scenario planning and influenza planning.
So did you start to ask questions then about what Northern Ireland's reasonable worst case scenario planning for a pandemic was and what those plans looked like?
Yes, and we would have been starting to work our way through that, and you can see that then developed throughout the course of the executive meetings where we were asking for more of this information to come through.
So are you talking about the meetings in February that you were scrutinising and asking about those plans?
Yes, so we would have, I believe, somewhere around this time also met with the head of the civil service, and they would have told us about the civil contingencies work that was happening at official level and supporting health as the lead department. I mean, I can't emphasise that enough. That was the approach that was taken, and we can all reflect on that. I know you don't want to get into reflections now, but we all will reflect on that. But the Department of Health were very firmly in the lead of the response up until this sort of period where things start to change.
I think what the inquiry is really interested in is understanding what planning was actually going on in Northern Ireland in February and what that in fact amounted to. And that's just what I want to focus on now, is understanding what you saw in February 2020 that reassured you or provided you with a real understanding of what this reasonable worst case scenario planning was in Northern Ireland.
So I think because it was so unprecedented and extraordinary times that we were probably all trying to find our way and to ask the relevant and pertinent questions as the situation was being developed. We were told consistently, the health advice was that we were still in containment phase, that we were told that the way the risk was referred to there as being moderate. We very much relied on the advice that we were getting from CMO and from health in terms of the progression. You saw a number of statements that we made to the Assembly Chamber so that elected representatives could be informed in terms of the approach. But I think that when you think back in terms of the health being the lead, I mean, I think it was understandable for all executive colleagues to believe that that was the right approach at those early times, because there was no other expertise outside of the Department of Health, and because the response was due to be as per influenza planning. I think that it became very clear then, as things developed, that we needed to have that wider systems approach. And I think that that's what you see developed whenever myself and the First Minister of that time got together and actually started to bring together that CCG work.
Sorry, maybe it was the way I asked the question. What did you see in February 2020? What plans did you see, did you scrutinise or interrogate in order to understand what the reasonable worst-case scenario planning for a pandemic, per the note from Ms Rooney of the 30th of January, amounted to?
I can't recall the exact date, but I will try to provide that to the inquiry. But we would have had a paper sent to the executive where we all would have discussed what this potentially could look like, interrogated that with both the Health Minister and the CMO. We didn't have a Chief Scientific Advisor at that time. But to be helpful to the inquiry, I will certainly find that date.
I'm talking about plans.
Yeah, but the plan, the date the plan would have been brought.
What you understood and what you scrutinised, as had been suggested by COBRA, to understand what the reasonable worst-case scenario plans were across government in Northern Ireland. That's what I'm trying to understand.
But again, at that time, it was very much a health lead, and it was their influenza plan that was being brought forward. And I don't recall at what date that was shared with the executive, but I'm happy to try to find that out.
Well, what the note of the 30th of January said was that the devolved administrations should review their worst-case scenario plans for a pandemic. So there might be a health component to that, yes? But
our understanding was that it was absolutely a health-led pandemic, so therefore a health-led plan. And that's the difference between we're not like Scotland, we're not like Wales. We don't operate in the same structure as others do. I don't offer that up to try to shirk responsibility. I offer it up as a political reality of the circumstance in which we were trying to deal with the pandemic. Health had the plan in terms of the reasonable worst case scenario, but then that obviously came across into civil contingencies as we move into February.
Right. Well, maybe we'll look at what happened in February then. But just to, as it were, set the scene for what was going on, Minister Swan, I think, attended 5 COBRAs, isn't that right, from the 24th of January onwards? Yes?
Yes.
So he attended the COBRAs throughout February, not you?
Yes, because I wasn't invited.
Minister Swan suggested that the invitation had gone to the Executive Office and that he had been designated, as it were, the representative from Northern Ireland to go to COBRA. Is that correct?
No, he was not designated by myself or the First Minister to attend. The invitation was at a health level. It was being chaired by Matt Hancock, the Health Minister in England, and they were pitched at that level, and it never came through either my desk or Arlene Foster's desk in terms of trying to, I suppose, to ask the Health Minister to attend. That was never brought to our attention. As far as and our understanding was that this was pitched very much at a health response at that stage. It was only whenever we were invited to a Prime Minister-led COBRA, which we then attended.
All right, I'll come back to that one on the 2nd of March. But I think that it must be right then, and I think from what you've said that this is correct, that the principal forum within which you were exercising your collective responsibility over the response to the pandemic was in the Executive Committee meetings during February. Is that right? I don't think we have a minute. We certainly haven't seen one for the meeting that I think took place on the 2nd or 3rd of February. That was the first time that the Executive Committee met, I think.
Yeah.
Correct? Which would have been very shortly after you received that briefing. But I think we do have the one for the next meeting, which is INQ 000 065 706. And I think if we just scroll down, please. And scroll down. There we go. So this appears to be the update that was given at this would have been the second meeting in February. I think this was the 10th of February. So by this stage, cases in the United Kingdom, correct?
Yes.
So just thinking again about the Rooney note that you had been sent at the end of February about spreading beyond China, it was now pretty much on your doorstep, correct?
Yes.
And if we just scroll down, see reference there, likely at some time we'll have a case in Northern Ireland. Yes?
Yes.
Officials to consider public health legislation. If we could scroll down, please. We've already seen this, the reference to the Department of Health working hard in the background. The First Minister seems to have asked if there would be similar powers to England. You say, keep us up to date. And that's it. That hardly speaks of interrogation or collective scrutiny of the health response, does it?
So with this, I mean, these notes are handwritten notes, which you know that we weren't even aware were being taken. And I don't know how reflective they are actually of our entire conversation. I can say, and I'm very confident, that we all were interrogating the evidence that was being put forward from health. And at this stage, we were still also being told we're in containment phase. At this stage, we were being told that that health were in the lead and that we didn't, that they weren't advancing NICMA being stood up even at that stage. But yes, I'm fairly certain that we did. I mean, I think that note doesn't reflect, certainly, it could reflect a flippancy, but that certainly wasn't there.
Well, we've got some very, very long notes of meetings, so I think we can be fairly confident that there's some approximation between the length of the note and the length of the meeting.
And perhaps I wouldn't have interrogated so much in the meeting, given that we had been speaking with health to advance that to that conversation.
I was very clear about asking you, Ms O'Neill, whether or not the collective responsibility for the response to the pandemic was being exercised through the Executive Committee meetings, and you agreed with me.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying that I'm not sure that note reflects just the depth of conversations that we would have had in an ongoing way.
So you've brought up containment. What were the steps being taken in Northern Ireland then in the containment phase at this stage?
So I think I would have to refer to the containment plans that the Department of Health had published, and I don't have them in front of me because I didn't know you were going to ask me about the specifics.
You mean the
of
plans of the 3rd of March?
The plans in terms of how we were going to contain the virus, which was obviously the approach from those early days in terms of trying to keep things out, particularly around travel. That was the issue which the COBRA were examining, because all cases at this stage were referred to being directly related to travel. So the containment phase was based around trying to keep the virus out. And it was very clear from health that they were in the space that they thought that we could still potentially contain the virus.
Okay. And above and beyond then travel, what else? What other measures were the government in Northern Ireland, what had been implemented or what was being done that you were aware of?
So the Civil Contingencies branch were supporting health and had started the work around talking to departments around their own preparedness, what perhaps different government departments might do to support the wider societal response. That was something that was being added to on a continual basis. you will have seen the note that would reflect what was happening, for example, in the Department of the Economy or the Department of Communities. And I think that was the focus of the civil contingencies at that time up until the early March period.
I think we've seen evidence that there were 2 people who worked in the civil contingencies branch. Is that what you're referring to? Work that those
people were doing to support the health-led response. But I will say this, I mean, the austerity agenda for 10 years stripped out our health service, our civil contingencies branch, and all of our public services. That meant that our public services were in a very poor state in which to respond to the pandemic. We also had a situation where, in terms of civil contingencies, a lot of those staff that were there were redirected to deal with the Brexit situation, and that meant that we were further behind in terms of preparedness, which I think we talked about in the first module, that we were 18 months behind. So there's no doubt that our system was stretched to breaking point. There's no doubt that it wasn't in a state of preparedness. There's no doubt that the resources and the staff weren't there. And there's no doubt that that made the response to the pandemic very, very difficult.
I'm sure we'll move on to this, but 85 people were trained to work in the hub. So it wasn't a question of people not having been trained, for example. The problem was that when, very late in the day, the hub was stood up, only 2 people volunteered to work in it.
And I found that shocking also. And I think it also points to the fact that even the head of the civil service can't insist that people move to work in this area whenever you need them to. And I think that's a fault line for sure. But I think that you can't escape the fact that the executive's in place only a short number of weeks, and it's coming in to deal with a backlog of all the issues of the day of government, but equally alongside that, not to repeat myself, but all those issues that we were dealing with in terms of the state of readiness, preparedness, the decimation of the public services. I mean, 10 years of stripping out. We also had the backdrop of our health workers, our health and social care workers, our nurses were out on strike. And that was the first thing that the executive settled in those very early days in terms of trying to offer a fair pay award and safe staffing levels for the staff, because they were on their knees.
I think I just really want to focus on what you did and what the executive committee were doing at this point in time, because that didn't require lots of people to be able to scrutinise what the Department of Health was doing. And perhaps if we move on to the next meeting, that's INQ 000 065 692. Thank you. If we just scroll down again, please. And if we continue to scroll down. I'm just going to bookmark there. We see reference to the CCG meeting taking place. And if we just scroll down a little more, please. I think that's it. Oh, yes, sorry, if we scroll down. Yes, I think that is it. I don't want to be unfair. There's something at 8, but it seems to refer back to what had been discussed earlier in the meeting. So if we could please just scroll back up again. Thank you. I think we can see that almost everything that is said by the Department of Health. I don't think, but of course please say if I'm wrong, that we see much evidence of questioning, challenging, scrutinising, asking questions by you and your colleagues Do you agree?
I think that this reflects quite a detailed run through all sorts of areas of work that were underway, including the regulations being developed, the fact that education, DAERA, finance, economy were all already working with health. I think it reflects where we are at that point in time, but I think that I'm fairly certain, despite this note, I'm fairly certain that our whole executive was engaged, very engaged, and working away trying to see what their department could bring to the table as they did throughout the course of the pandemic.
I am going to come, Ms O'Neill, to look at the plans, because we've seen an overarching plan dated the 13th of March, and we have, I'm sure you're aware, asked questions of civil servants and ministers about what those plans amounted to. But just coming back to the point about questions or challenge or scrutiny, that's not conveyed by this minute, is it? It's an update.
It's an update in terms of the urgent decision on the regulations. I believe
this is not substantive discussion, is it?
But I still don't think that this note reflects the scale of conversation that we would have had in our executive meetings, which would have been considerably in detail. As a matter of fact, at one stage, I think I did actually ask that notes are kept verbatim so that we would have that type of information, but I don't think this reflects the fact that the executive committee together was collectively scrutinising what was coming forward.
So, sorry, are you saying that the discussions that took place in February were substantive discussions about
No, I
response?
think it's fair to say that the substantive discussions came from early March, but there was certainly a lot of discussion in advance of that.
Yes, because I was going to say, Ms O'Neill, you say at paragraph 34 of your witness statement, on the 2nd of March 2020, the executive held its first substantive discussion about COVID-19.
Yes.
So the discussions that took place in February were not substantive discussions, were they?
It's at that juncture of March where it starts to become an all of executive moving towards the NICMA arrangements being stood up. So therefore, you'll see from every note from that, that's where it starts to become more detailed.
Again, I think that's a question that permits of a yes or no answer.
Well, the first, I've acknowledged in my statement, the first substantive discussion is the 2nd of March.
Yes. So again, these discussions in February, these meetings, this collective responsibility that the Executive Committee is exercising over the response to the pandemic in Northern Ireland did not involve any substantive discussion. Correct?
I will say that because I'm not going to continue to argue back that there were substantive conversations happening with the Department of Health, with myself and the First Minister, with the head of the Civil Service around the preparedness and what the role of the Department of Health was as we then moved towards the role of the wider executive.
Ms O'Neill, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm just repeating what you have said in your witness statement. On the 2nd of March 2020, the Executive held its first substantive discussion about COVID-19.
Yes, I did say that.
And if we can just complete the meetings in February, if we could go please to INQ 000 273 788. And if you could scroll to page 9, please. So again, to be clear, this is the 24th of February. And if we could go over the page, please. That's it.
Sorry,
Sorry, did you ask me a question?
Well, you knew by this stage, it's the 24th of February. There is obviously a very considerable amount of information known and available to you about the position that had been reached and the risk that Northern Ireland was at. And this is the collective responsibility being exercised. Do you agree?
Yes, this was our conversation, yes.
And it barely amounts to anything, does it?
Again, it's a handwritten note that I can't stand over.
Even assuming, and of course it must be right, that this isn't a full note.
I just don't think it reflects the nature of what we were dealing with in those early days.
Well, I think it reflects, doesn't it, what you said in your witness statement at paragraph 34, that there hadn't been any substantive discussion until the 2nd of March. It's consistent with that, isn't it?
Yes.
My lady, I think we're probably just coming up to the break. My
I'm
lady,
terribly
is that...
sorry, I was-
No. I could see you were deep in concentration. I think we'd come to the break.
I was. I'm
And
sorry,
that
it's no
seemed like a-
disrespect to you. So, no, so sorry. I'm sure you're used to multitasking. I shall be back at 11:30. I hope we're not late. I think First Minister and I had similar problems getting down here, fighting with the dirty bed linen.
I won't ask. Miss O'Neill, when we finished just before that short adjournment, we had gone through the meetings that had taken place in February, and you touched upon the work that you understood was being done by the CCPB, so the Civil Contingencies Policy Branch. And that sat within the Executive Office, didn't it?
Yes.
In your witness statement, your January witness statement, so the main one, March statement, you say at paragraph 21, I don't need to take you to it unless you want to look at it, but you say there that you are aware of a 22nd of January 2020 paper about sector resilience. And that's a paper about which the inquiry has heard quite a lot.
Sure.
Because it's the one that said that Northern Ireland was 18 months behind the rest of the UK. Were you aware of that, though, at the time, that was the concern within the Executive Office or within that branch specifically?
I think that might have become more to my knowledge at the time of preparation for Module 1, whenever we were reviewing the paperwork. So I don't think it was never elevated to us as an issue of concern until we saw it at that time.
All right. And we've also seen that there was a report in November 2019, the PwC Futures report, that had made 85, I think, separate recommendations about civil contingencies in Northern Ireland. Again, was that something that you were aware about at the time?
No, because that would have been produced in advance of the executive being restored in the middle of January.
The
So it
fact
wasn't
that
brought
it
to our
was,
attention.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you. The fact that it was produced, obviously, before you were restored wouldn't have stopped anyone from drawing it to your attention, though,
No, that's
once
true.
you came back. And in particular, once it was understood within the Civil Contingencies branch that obviously there was an emergency hurtling towards Northern Ireland. But you're clear it wasn't.
No,
You weren't told about
absolutely
it.
don't remember that, no.
We've also seen a paper that was provided to the TEO board on the 25th of February that referred to the fact that civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland hadn't been reviewed for 20 years. And the review was sought to ensure effective arrangements are in place to enable the executive to support wider citizens and wider society in the event of an unforeseen emergency event or situation. And again, were you aware or did you know that that paper had been generated or that a review was being sought at that point in time?
No, that wasn't brought to our attention.
It must have been clear to you, though, Miss O'Neill, as matters progressed throughout February, that there were barely any staff in the civil contingencies branch.
So I think the first time that it becomes more aware is whenever we have the memo from Chris Stewart, who heads up that area of work. I think it's only at that time where they start to raise the issues of staffing, etc. To that point, we were of the view that it was being dealt with at an official level in terms of support for health, but the issue of staffing wasn't brought to our attention until we actually got into that sort of 2nd of March period.
And I was going to ask you what date, in terms of the note that you're talking about, the Chris Stewart note, which one is it that you're actually referring to?
I think I've left it upstairs, but I think there may be one of the 3rd of March.
Right.
I think perhaps.
So again, just in terms of trying to understand your responsibilities, you've said that health was a matter for the Department of Health in February. I'm not going to go back over the issue of collective responsibility, but civil contingencies sat within the Executive Office and was therefore something that you could have been inquiring into and ensuring were ready to respond to what you understood was the position in February 2020.
So at that juncture, nothing had come to our attention that we were in any way, lacking of staff. It was only around that 2nd of March period where we started to realise that actually the staff weren't in place, and perhaps also that the preparedness that you would expect wasn't in place. There was the work that I referred to earlier of cross-departmental at official level, asking for areas of intervention, areas that departments were looking at. That was very clear throughout the middle of February. But it was actually became clear in conversations with the head of the civil service, David Sterling at that time, that the staff weren't there. And I think that's reflected insofar as they had to then go and source staff to come in. For example, Karen Pearson coming into the Executive Office to actually take the lead on the work around civil contingency and produce that first paper. And that's where things started to change.
That comes later in March, doesn't it?
She's approached it early March, but comes into post, I think, on the 16th of March.
Yes, I'm just trying to understand what was it comes back to this point, what was going on in Northern Ireland in February in order to prepare for the oncoming pandemic. And it's trying to understand, Miss O'Neill, whether or not or what work was being done within the Executive Office in order to get civil contingencies arrangements readied for what I'm sure you'll agree was becoming inevitable.
So I think that these are the early days of the fledgling executive, and we were trying to deal with all the other attendant parts of government, programme for government, budget, investment strategy, delivering on New Decade, New Approach to the political agreement that brought people together. So I think even when I reflected just on the break around some of the minutes of those meetings, some meetings were directly to do with those things, and health mightn't have been the specific topic for that executive, and perhaps that's why the minutes don't reflect a more detailed conversation, but that's just to offer that up. I think that the Executive Office itself was busy with trying to deliver all of those things, and we were very much being guided again by the fact that this was being dealt with health in the lead, because they had the expertise. But I certainly, I know that across CCG, albeit with limited staff, there was work going on with other departments, and that became clear in that table that started to be produced, I think, around the 18th of February, perhaps, where it refers to the work of other departments and what's being done and how that was being collated.
So again, just trying to understand what was taking place, because you said in the earlier part of your evidence that there was this, the the staff in the Civil Contingencies branch were helping other departments coordinate with the Department of Health. Is that right?
It's very clear from the briefing papers that we got that CCG it was indicated they were helping the Department of Health with their preparedness work.
Right, and I'm just trying to understand then again the scrutiny that was brought to bear on the planning that was going on around that time and what you were doing to familiarise yourself with the plans that were taking place across government.
So at this stage, it was an official level. It was only elevated to ministerial level on the 2nd of March, whenever we had that first.
So again, just to be clear, because I don't want to be unfair to you, we've seen the scrutiny that there was of the health response. There's very little discussion or consideration about what other departments are doing in February. Do you agree? Reflected in the minutes.
Reflected in the minutes, of course, but I think it becomes clear that as we move even just a short number of weeks ahead, you can start to see where other ministers have been doing their preparedness in terms of what their department can do, the mitigations that can be put in place, where they fit in terms of the wider picture around the pandemic response.
So just trying to understand, sorry, I'm staying with February for the moment because February is obviously a very important month in the development of the pandemic. Is it correct then that there's no ministerial oversight of what is being done, and I mean collective oversight again, of what's being done by departments in order to prepare for the pandemic?
No, it was done at official level until the 2nd of March, yeah.
And we can see that throughout that period, and indeed I think it's right, until the 18th of March, that there was a single CCG meeting of officials that took place on the 20th of February.
Yes, because it was still being taken forward at an official level at that point.
Yes, but it's a single meeting
Yes.
of officials on the 20th of February, and that's it.
And
There is no other CCG meeting that takes place of officials before the 18th of March. Do you agree?
Yes, that's what the note reflects, and I think that is testimony to the nature of the Civil Contingencies branch, which I've just referred to earlier, in terms of the fact that they were stripped out of staff, the fact that they didn't have the people there doing the preparedness work, the fact that they were distracted with the Brexit work. I think it's a combination of those factors that probably led to that scenario that you've just described.
Why would it have taken a number of people to convene a meeting of officials across departments in order to understand what planning work they were doing in February? Why has that got anything to do with the Civil Contingencies branch being so depleted?
Because ministers are very dependent on officials bringing forward advice, and that's how you decide. So different papers, different options, different scenarios will be painted in an official level document, and then we will make decisions based on that advice that comes forward. It was the 2nd of March before we got that first piece of advice around standing up NICMA, and that's where we moved to immediately then once we had that piece of advice.
Do you agree, Ms O'Neill, if there was only one single meeting of officials before the 18th of March 2020, that does not suggest that there was any sustained effort at cross-departmental working in Northern Ireland leading up to the pandemic?
I think it would suggest that, but to be fair to officials, I've no doubt that outside of that one meeting, direction was given and people were off doing what they could, but I would absolutely concur that you could take that from that, Jess.
The inquiry has seen the priorities that came out of that meeting. I don't know if that's a document that you have seen, and it lists only 4 things at a very, very high level, but it doesn't reflect any of the planning that one might have expected to see at that point in time. I don't want to be unfair to you because I'm not sure that you've seen that document, and I don't want to hijack you about it, but the inquiry has put it before a number of witnesses now.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wouldn't reflect the severity of the situation if that's the case, because, but it probably reflects the advice that still in February and into early March that health were telling us that there was a moderate risk, and that they weren't asking for things to be escalated at that point. So that probably reflects that, but I can't speak to it because I don't know the document.
Well, perhaps we'll give you a chance to look at it over lunchtime and we can come back to it if we need to. But again, it's just trying to understand, Miss O'Neill, why were you and Baroness Foster not scrutinising much more closely as time moved on in February what was going on across departments in order to prepare for the pandemic?
I think it's a fair reflection that we were very much guided by the health advice in those initial weeks, and I think on reflection, certainly I would have thought that if we were in that scenario again, we would absolutely stand up much sooner, and we would have taken that approach. So I think we can reflect that we were perhaps too heavily dependent on the health approach in those early weeks up until the 2nd of March.
Forgive me, why would it depend on the health approach? Why wasn't it clear throughout February that you were going to need to respond on an all-society basis to the pandemic?
I think it's reflected in some of the notes that departments were responding and were doing the preparatory work. But it was the reality that in those early days, health were the only people that had the expertise and the advice. We were receiving the information from SAGE and were advising us. And they were absolutely, and as a matter of fact, asking for NICMA not to be stood up and not for these wider arrangements to be put in place because they felt like it would interfere with what they were doing.
Where do we see you suggesting that NICMA should be stood up? When do we see you saying, can I question that, or I wonder about that? Or is that really right? Where do we see that?
So I think certainly towards the end of February and into those early days of March when we received that first piece of advice, that's where we would have been very much focused around, both Arlene and myself, on the conversation around preparedness and civil contingencies. I think that neither herself or myself had any counter advice to say the approach that was being taken was not the correct approach because we were in a health pandemic.
Why does it take counter advice for two leaders of a devolved administration to say, actually, we are the leaders of government. We have responsibility for the people of Northern Ireland. We need to stand up the civil contingencies arrangements, or we need to really scrutinise why they're not being stood up.
The nature of government is that we depend on advice coming forward, and there was no counter advice to the approach that was being advocated by the Department of Health.
Why does it take advice for the leaders of government to need? Why do you have to be advised that you need that?
Well, of course,
why do you have to be advised?
Of course, you bring your own
question or
insights.
challenge.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut across you. Of course, you bring what you know and your own understanding of things. But equally, we were, and I think this is a lesson learned, my lady, we were too dependent on the Department of Health in those early days. I think that's very clear, particularly now whenever we reflect on having come through this period. NICMA should have been stood up earlier, but I only offer up the reality of the circumstance that we were dealing with at that time, and I'm quite sure that Arlene Foster will say the exact same thing tomorrow.
It's very easy, isn't it, to constantly say it was the Department of Health and they had too much power, or this was their response, they were leading it.
It's not very easy to say it. It's just a reality of the circumstance. But it's not about trying to put all the focus on them. We have to take collective responsibility. That's okay. This inquiry is to learn lessons. That's why I'm here. And I think that there are lessons to be learned in that early period, for sure. But it's not about just saying, trying to apportion the blame to health. They had the expertise. They had the knowledge. They were attending SAGE and we were dependent upon them. And let me be very clear, the Health Minister had a hugely difficult job. It was a harrowing time for any decision maker, to be quite frank, and I think that the Health Minister did his very best, and we all will reflect on what we could have done better. But for sure, the Health Minister, his officials, all the people that work in the Department of Health were all trying their best in unprecedented times. So I don't want there to be any impression other than that. I would put on record the great work that they did in these challenging circumstances.
Mr O'Neill, that's revisionism, isn't it? Because you did criticise Minister Swan in public at a very early stage of the pandemic, didn't you? And you went on to accuse him of slavishly following Boris Johnson. You did, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And I don't think that that is revisionism at all. I think that Robin had a very, very difficult job to do. He himself has indicated that we worked well together. But it's also incumbent upon me as a leader, when you talk about my leadership responsibilities, when something's not right, to call it out. That's not politics. That's just the difference between what I think is right and wrong. And I did believe in those early days that the Department of Health here were following a Boris Johnson approach that was too slow to act. And I still stand over that position. Now, would it have been preferable to be able to iron these things out within the executive? Then yes, of course it would have been. Do I wish that we had been able to do that? Yes, absolutely. Do I regret that we couldn't? Yes, absolutely. But I did feel that I couldn't stay quiet on something that was so important. And indeed, we might be having a different conversation today if that was the case.
Ms O'Neill, too slow to act. You had all of February to act. You had all of February to do more. And you didn't, did you?
And as I've stated, we had a very much Department of Health-led response in those early weeks, who were guided by the sage advice that came from London. And I think that that advice was too slow in those early days, and the inquiry will critique that for itself.
I'm going to move on, if I may, to examine some of the meetings then that took place in March 2020. And if we could bring up, please, INQ 000 065 694. Again, the inquiry has seen this, Miss O'Neill. If we could scroll up, please. We can see that the Department of Health set out the up-to-date information. The Chief Medical Officer. Thank you. We can carry on scrolling. And I just want to note there, Miss O'Neill, I think there's some mention of schools by the Minister for the Department of Education. And if we could just carry on, please. And I think we see there, yes, just at the bottom of that page, and we've looked at this advice that was being provided by the CMO. Thank you. And I think reference to the fact that the case fatality rate could be 2 to 3%, correct?
Yes.
And if we carry on, please. I think that that's the end of the meeting. Thank you. We can check just to make absolutely sure, Miss O'Neill, but I think that that's the extent of it. Yes, I think that's it. Again, I think that that's largely a question of, or largely conveys, that there was a briefing by the CMO and the Department of Health, and we see some discussion on the part of the Department of Education about schools. But again, there isn't much of a sense of urgency having regard to that meeting, or any sense of scrutiny or the seeking of information, for example, by you about what plans were being put in place in the Department of Health, either to continue containing the virus or what might be done in the event that it could no longer be contained. Do you agree?
So this is the meeting dated the 2nd?
2nd of March.
I think this is where we can really start to see the substantive conversation coming through and schools being mentioned as a potential issue. And I think is that perhaps also the same day that we go to COBRA meeting?
So this is the first date, and I think in fact this meeting might end because you're going to COBRA.
Yeah. And the question you asked me?
I don't think, again, from these minutes that we see that there's much anxious scrutiny on your part, or perhaps on anyone's part, about what the detailed planning was that was going on within the Department of Health, for example, in order to either maintain the containment phase or in terms of plans that was putting in place in the event that the pandemic started to really impact upon Northern Ireland. Do you agree?
And this is just the day before we have the advice to stand up NICMA as well. So, I mean, I think there was a lot of conversations happening, not necessarily at the executive meeting, but this conversation would have been continuing on a daily basis at this stage with the Health Minister.
I don't think you got advice to stand up NICMA on the 3rd of March. I think you received a paper on the 3rd of March.
Sorry, that we brought to the executive then?
Yes.
We agreed to bring it to the executive.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think that it
Sorry, you're right. I
contains any advice. Yeah. I think it just explains the most basic aspects, possibly, of what the civil contingencies arrangements are.
Yes, it sets out the
Ireland.
roles of
Yes.
different bodies and talks about the need to bring it for activation.
Yes, that didn't come for a considerable period of time, did it?
It came, I think, maybe very soon after, maybe 10 days after, I'm not sure.
Yes,
exactly.
the decision to stand up civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland didn't happen until the 16th of March.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, we'll come back to that. So, do you agree? Not much challenge, scrutiny, understanding of what the detailed arrangements are in Northern Ireland evident at this meeting on the 2nd of March?
Well, I think it's a fairly expansive note in terms of what we've been briefed on, but in terms of a note that reflects interrogation of it all, then I agree with you.
I think, again, it's just trying to understand, Miss O'Neill, what level of scrutiny and understanding was being brought to bear on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland as to what in fact was being done on their behalf in order to prepare for the pandemic. And again, if this is the exercise of collective responsibility, it suggests not a lot.
I think we all have to reflect on these early days, given that we were a new executive, that this was unprecedented, that we were trying to get to grips with it. But I think that's a fair assessment of those early days.
And I think, in fact, when we go to the next meeting, which is the 10th of March, and if we could go please to this, it's INQ 000 695. And again, I think we see here, and if we could just scroll slowly, and if we just pause there, thank you. I think we can see at the bottom of page 1, and that's still, I think, the Health Minister providing his briefing, that officials were getting tired and looking to other departments for coordination. That might suggest, Ms O'Neill, that there wasn't really any coordination at that point in time. Do you agree?
I can't confirm that. I mean, I only can say that the officials reported from the middle of February that they were working at a cross-departmental way. But no doubt, health were getting tired, given that they had told us that they were preparing for this for 7 weeks, so therefore people were working around the clock trying to deal with an unprecedented circumstance. So absolutely wouldn't doubt the fact that that is the case for the staff.
And if we could just go on, please, at page 2, and I think this is you who says executive approach needs to kick in, all need to contribute. Yes, thank you, it's just at the bottom. Rule for us all. That appears to be the first time or the first reflection by you that in fact the executive did need to exercise collective responsibility for all of this. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that it's fair to say that that's the first time that it's minuted, yes. And my contribution there was to try to ensure that we were all recognising that we needed to help health, that we all needed to play our part. That's why I refer to a role for us all. And I also acknowledge the hard work. So I think the commentary is a recognition that this is, for us all now to get really sleeves rolled up and in together.
It's a really belated recognition of that, isn't it?
I think the WHO had declared the pandemic on the early March.
The 11th of March.
11th of March.
The day after this.
Yes.
But it had declared, without going back through everything, and in fact you referenced this yourself, that, for example, it was on the 24th of February that WHO had said that there needed to be an all-society approach to the pandemic and that there needed to be preparations for non-pharmaceutical interventions. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. And I think that this is one of those reflection points that we'll absolutely have to take on board.
Yeah, because it's belated and it's late in the day. Yes.
Yes, that's. I don't want to keep repeating myself, but when we understood health was in the lead, I think on reflection, both myself and the then First Minister would indicate that we should have stepped in sooner, despite the pushback that we were getting, which will become more evident from the minutes.
It's not very clear from the minutes to date.
Sorry, not the minutes. Some of the exchanges which you saw in terms of CMO to health or HOCs to somebody else were in danger of ministers getting ahead of things, didn't want us to intervene.
I am going to take you to that,
Sure,
because
okay.
that is a fair point, and I do want to explore with you the separate issue of the CMO responding in respect of the Cabinet Office. But I'm just focusing on you
Sure.
at the moment, Miss O'Neill, and trying to understand whether or not you're saying that at this point in time you were being pushed back from activating NICMA, or that you were being pushed back from exercising collective responsibility. Because what I was going to respectfully suggest is that the notes certainly don't convey that in these meetings.
But the executive meeting is one meeting in a week, or perhaps there was a number of meetings, but it's one meeting. Where outside of that, there would have been a considerable number of other discussions in terms of head of civil service, for example, or health and CMO. We were engaged in a range of things. But look, I'm here to learn lessons, so I absolutely accept that this work and this approach could have been done sooner, and I take that on board.
I just want to come back to just understanding the facts, Ms O'Neill, and whether or not you are saying at this point in time you were being advised that NICMA shouldn't be stood up, whether that had reached you. I think that's one thing. Or second, and it's a second question, whether anyone was pressurising you and Baroness Foster not to exercise the kind of responsibility that you were obliged to
So on the second
exercise.
point, no one was advocating that we don't exercise our rights. What we were being advised was just that health were the lead still at that point. On NICMA, it was very clear that we were being pushed back in terms of the wider executive approach. It was very clear that health wanted to maintain their lead role, and perhaps maybe they have good reasons for why they thought that was appropriate at that time. But the arrangements in the document you referred to earlier talk about the lead responsibility, and every briefing that we had was that they were the lead. So I think just to acknowledge that for me is a learning. It's an experience that clearly we'd never been through before, and we were too heavily dependent on that health advice in those early days.
I mean, given that it takes up until the 16th of March for NICMA to be activated, you can't be suggesting that you didn't feel for that period of time that you and Baroness Foster simply didn't have the agency to require these arrangements to be stood up if you thought they should be?
We thought that we would, or we were, working through this with health, and we knew that, and at one stage it was said that to stand up the arrangements too soon would be problematic. So yes, we had the agency, so that's why I concede the point that perhaps we could have insisted that it was stood up, but we would have done so against the advice of the head of civil service and health.
I'm not sure that we've seen Sir David Stirling providing advice that these arrangements shouldn't be stood up.
Sorry, his I'll correct myself there. His advice was around school closures and about getting ahead of the advice. But there's certainly references in documents where it said that they didn't want NICMA stood up from health. They didn't want NICMA stood up at that time.
Yes, I think, again, I'm trying to focus on what you understood and why you didn't exercise the power that you had.
But I'm trying to explain that perhaps very badly, but I'm trying to explain that we were being pushed back in terms of standing up the arrangements that we were being asked, that health maintains the lead responsibility, and at the right juncture, then we'd be asked to stand up NICMA.
I'm sure we'll come back to this because we'll look at some of the other minutes. But just having looked at the minutes for the 10th of March, and I think we can just scroll down. I think we can see, if we just pause there, we can see the head of the civil service saying departments to do impact assessments and risk assessments. That suggests, Ms O'Neill, doesn't it, that in fact that work hadn't taken place by that point. Do you agree?
In terms of impact assessments, perhaps that is correct, yes. I know there was that other document that was populated on the 18th of February that looked at different departments' roles and responsibilities, but that certainly suggests that impact assessments perhaps weren't carried out at that stage.
Well, I'll take you to the document that and if it's not the right document, we can go to the one that you're referring to, but we've certainly seen a document dated the 13th of March that sets out the planning work that had been done. I think, we can scroll very slowly down so that I can ask you about this point. I think we can probably do it slightly faster. And if I can just pause there, I think we see that there's mention by the Department of Education about closing schools too early. And if we scroll down a little bit further, please. And I think if we just pause there, you ask about the next COBRA. This is the 10th of March. I don't think that there's any reference or any suggestion in this meeting that you were pressing or suggesting that schools ought to be closed.
Not at the 10th. I mean, it was something that was clearly very actively on our minds, but at that stage, no. what I refer to there is the next COBRA. It was to try to get more advice around what the sage advice would be in terms of where we would go to next. So things quickly develop after this day.
All right. So we can be clear that at the point of this meeting, you're not pressing for schools to be shut.
No, I didn't have advice to say that.
All right. And I think that if we go to, I'm just going to pick up, if I may, at page 12 and paragraph 42 of your statement. Just to put this in context, I think that the paragraph above refers to the fact that the Republic of Ireland had announced, thank you. So it had announced a package of measures, hadn't it?
It had.
And if we just go back to 42, please. And you say that personally I agreed with the substance of the measures announced by the Irish government and the timing. As I've said previously, I believe now, and I believed at the time, that the UK government was too slow to move to restrictions in response. The Irish government response appeared to me more in line with WHO and ECDC advice, which was to the effect that early intervention was the best way to slow the virus down. Thank you, that can come down. So just so that we're clear about this, obviously when you say or you state that you thought that there should have been earlier intervention, that's not intervention that you were pressing for on the 10th of March, correct?
No, not on the 10th, because I wanted to have the COBRA discussion and further discussions.
And in fact, it appears from the discussions that had taken place on the 10th of March that there doesn't appear to have been any serious contemplation at that point that schools might actually close in Northern Ireland. Do you agree?
In the executive meeting, yes, that's correct.
I mean, in terms of proper planning and everything that the closure of schools would involve, there wasn't any contemplation of that, was there?
Clearly, just in terms of the reflection of the Education Minister himself around what mitigation would need to look like if we were to move to that juncture. But clearly, it's a very fast-moving situation. But that initial conversation, then obviously, we were going to have the COVID meeting, or the COBRA meeting, and then obviously things changed with what happened in terms of the south of Ireland moving to close schools, a lot of European countries moving to close schools, and just our own then position around that became a fraught one.
Well, on the 10th of March, we've seen that your contribution to this meeting was to suggest that an executive approach needed to kick in. Correct? Mm-hmm. You hadn't even come close, it would appear, to thinking about an all-government response to the pandemic at that point. Do you agree?
Well, no, I don't think that's correct, because I think that you'll see that when Karen Pearson comes in just a short number of days later, the work that we've been asking for in terms of the whole-of-government approach starts to, I suppose, take more shade and more light in terms of developing those proposals. But on the issue of schools at that time, we were clearly, it was in the minds of ministers, the fact that we discussed it at all. But it was also very clear that health and CMO's advice at that stage wasn't to move, that we were still in a containment phase. So that would have guided that discussion at that moment in time. But this was fast moving, it was day by day, and sometimes events really take over, and I think the issue of schools was a really firm example of sometimes something that happens, because we live in a small island, 2 jurisdictions back to back, and particularly in the relation to the issue of schools closure, parents in Strabane couldn't understand why parents in Lifford weren't sending their children to school. It just didn't, it couldn't compute in people's minds, so much so that I just couldn't understand it, and I tried to understand it from within the executive. I tried to ask the CMO about the difference of advice. I wasn't privy to what the advice was in Dublin. If Dublin were wrong and were at different junctures throughout the pandemic, I would say that. If London were right, I would say that. But where I think something's not wrong either way, or not right either way, I feel obliged that I would have to articulate that. But I think that on the issue of schools, the public had lost. This was I suppose the first big issue that the public witnessed and experienced, and people were afraid. people were anxious and they just couldn't fathom how our advice could be different. And I put our advice, the SAGE advice that we were receiving, in the backdrop of people feeling that mass gatherings in London was absolutely the wrong approach, or in England was the wrong approach. So it felt like we were caught up in a system that we didn't feel was right. Now, we went through, as further executive meetings will show, we went through a considerable conversation around this as to how to adequately deal with it. And we knew there wasn't any, these were rock and a hard place decisions. So to be fair to all of my ministerial colleagues, these were constantly rock and a hard place decisions, but particularly in this first issue of schools. It didn't bode well, for the executive not being on the agreed spot. But I would suspect that if I found myself in the same situation again, that would be the same position that I would adopt. I would try to influence from within, and where not possible, I tried to influence it from outside. And also I think that the position that I advocated was vindicated, because Milady, the advice from SAGE didn't change from when I articulated that we should move to that position to when we actually did move to that position. Nothing fundamentally changed, apart from the fact that parents had chosen to remove their children from schools. Parents were not sending their children to schools. Now, also still on the flip side of all of that, the implications for families with school closures was immense. And again, this comes back to the rock and the hard place, but you were ultimately trying to shut things down in order to try to save lives. And that was the rock and the hard place that we constantly found ourselves in.
Can I interrupt? Did you ever get any evidence on whether shutting schools would in fact have a significant impact on the spread of the virus?
I think as the pandemic progressed, it became clear from our medical advice and scientific advice that the things that had the biggest impact on spreading, on containing the virus, or at least reducing the spread, were schools and hospitality. That became a very evidence position that was advanced from health the whole way through, that whenever it came to, for example, later in the year, another difficult time in November, it was basically it's schools or hospitality pick, because they're the things that have the most impact. So I think that became more apparent as time went on, as opposed to perhaps at the start of the pandemic.
I think not every expert would necessarily agree, but that was the advice you were getting.
Yeah.
Perhaps if we just look at what the position was on the 12th of March, if we go to INQ 000 289 859. And the inquiry has seen this, Miss O'Neill. It's a meeting that took place on the 12th of March. If we just scroll down, please. And we can see that it was instigated because of the announcement that had been made by the Taoiseach, announcing a package of measures. And if we go down, please. So we can see that the Health Minister was reflecting the SAGE advice that when schools shut, it should be for 15 weeks. But unlikely to have a significant impact. If we go down, please. And then we can see reference to 340,000 children not being at school. The impact it might have on health services. And just pausing there, presumably that's because no arrangements had been made in Northern Ireland, nor any contingencies put in place as to what might happen to the workforce if schools were to shut.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
And again, I think if we just go down, please, I think we've already looked at this, but I think we can see the reference made about the biggest issues being exams and those eligible for free school meals. And I think it's right. I think you were referred to in this as well. And I think that it's right that your concern was, and I think you've said this, not that you had any scientific advice to counter what was being advised here, but that the position was different in the Republic of Ireland.
And not at all for that reason. I know that it's quite simplistic for people to jump to that conclusion, but it certainly was never my approach the whole way through the pandemic. As I said, if I thought something was right, I would follow it. If it was about saving lives, I would have done it, regardless of where it came from. I mean, I was guided the whole way through from the CMO and Chief Scientific Advisor, who got their advice from SAGE.
So
it's UK SAGE, so it didn't take counter alternative advice, but on this occasion, parents couldn't fathom why schools were closed 2 minutes up the road from the school that their kids go to. We had lost those people's confidence, and we needed to try and recapture it. And I'm glad then that we got to the right position and then tried to get things more in an even keel. But I do, as I said, fully put my hands up in terms of the way we got to that point isn't ideal. We did try to find consensus, but it wasn't forthcoming. Because I had no advice to counter the Chief Medical Officer's advice. I didn't have access to what advice they were receiving in Dublin. But what I couldn't understand, I couldn't compute in my head why the advice would be so different around something so fundamental as school closure. And I couldn't compute with my head around who had published and ECDC had published around the intervention piece. So I couldn't understand it. I tried to go along with the consensus, and I did so for a period of time. But then I could see it happening all around me. We had, the public were taking unmanaged approach. Some schools were closed, some weren't. Some schools were extending their holidays to see how things worked out in terms of advice. And we had a hodgepodge of approach, and that wasn't going to be helpful either. But then clearly it all changed within 2 days whenever SAGE advice changed to move towards school closure.
Sorry, so why weren't you making any of those points on the 10th of March at the Executive Committee meeting?
I'm very confident that I made all of those remarks. I'm very confident that I made them directly to the Chief Medical Officer, the Health Minister, the First Minister, every executive colleague. I'm very confident that what I said to you today is what I said at the time, both privately and publicly. I believe that this was the first big issue that we had to contend with, the first difficult issue that we had to contend with. And again, nobody's motivation was anything other than trying to do the right thing. And perhaps we had a different approach in terms of what we thought that was. But I'm assuming that's not unique to ourselves.
Sorry, I don't think the minutes of the 10th of March reflect in any way an argument or a discussion, a discussion about closing schools and what the ramifications of that might be and what the justifications might be. And I think you've accepted that you didn't press on the 10th of March for schools to close.
Yes, but because I think the action of the Irish government to move towards school closures precipitated a whole new set of circumstance, which meant that we were now into that different spot. And again, let me be critical. They took that decision and didn't tell us. That wasn't good enough, because that actually led and fed into that confusion and put us all in a very difficult spot. We thought we were working up till obviously a point where it looked apparent that this is where we would be headed, but it certainly, their movement then, combined with all the other factors that I've described, I think meant that the public position was very different to the executive position. But thankfully we changed it.
So just being clear about it, it's the fact that the Republic of Ireland announced it, that's what changed your position. Is that correct, or is it more nuanced than that?
It's much more nuanced than that, because of my view of Boris Johnson's approach, also because when you look towards what was happening across, because we were all in unprecedented times, so you were looking towards what was happening elsewhere. And I think Scotland perhaps had moved to announce closures. I think, not 100% sure. I think that when you look towards the international community, school systems were shutting down across the board. So it was increasingly creeping up on us, as did a lot of these things, because of just the nature of how the rapidly unfolding pandemic came towards us. So I think that absolutely it's more nuanced, and I would definitely absolutely push back on any sort of charge of it being political or just because Dublin did it. If Dublin were wrong, I would say they were wrong, and they were wrong. They were wrong not to tell us. They were wrong not to share that advice, and they were wrong at different junctures, as played out throughout the course of the pandemic, where at times we were at a different spot to them in terms of transmission. And we had to constantly, our executive had to constantly manage that tension. And even at that, even if I had wanted to do everything on an all-island basis all of the time, we live in a jurisdiction where the finances, the Treasury controls how we can spend our budget. And we wouldn't have the ability to even bring in measures that we would want to bring in perhaps at a point in time, unless we had that financial support from Treasury and a barring consequential. But on the schools issue, it wasn't about money. It was about trying to get ahead and actually grab the right decision. As I said, we did get there, but it's definitely never about politics for me. This is absolutely, fundamentally about what I believed was the right thing to do.
You say it's not about money, it's about planning, isn't it? It's about ensuring that Northern Ireland was in a position to close its schools, and it wasn't at that date, as we've just seen from the 10th of March, was it?
Yeah, you're right. But we're also a number of weeks into a new executive, 3 years with no politics and nothing being put in place, and then the austerity impact that I previously mentioned. So I don't think anybody can divorce those things, even if we had have done things a lot sooner, which I have said I accept that. But even if we had have, we would never have been in an ideal position to deal with the scale of the challenge that we had ahead of us, because we were only a number of weeks in around that executive table again.
I think it's right that on the 12th of March you made a public statement that Northern Ireland was not at the stage that it needed to close schools. Is that right?
Yes, because that was where I was trying to work with the wider executive team and provide that united front.
And then on the 13th of March, you issued a public statement, I think, in your position as Vice President of Sinn Féin, calling for the immediate closure of schools. What changed overnight?
In 24 hours, a lot had changed. I think I've just reflected some of that. I think that we had lost the wider public. They were taking their children out of schools. The Catholic bishops had come out and asked for all schools to close their doors. So we now were very, very quickly, rapidly descending into an unmanaged school closure. It was much, much better to do it in a managed way. And that was why I felt obliged to speak out. No, I couldn't get that concerted agreement, that joined up effort and agreement in the executive itself, because the CMO had advised that we were not in the position to move to this juncture yet. But I still don't know to this day what changed between me advocating that position, and I did very strongly in the executive and in the discussions that we had, and then what changed actually whenever we moved to school closures, because nothing changed in terms of the evidence.
Just focusing for a moment on what happened over these days, we knew that there had been a meeting on the 10th of March, and you made your statement supporting schools staying open on the 12th of March, and then the contrary statement on the 13th of March. There was no meeting of ministers, was there, between your change of position? I think that's right.
There'd have been no executive meeting, but there certainly would have been meetings across both myself and Arlene Foster as joint heads, and also with health and education. Did
you try and convene a meeting in order that you could discuss this and make a collective decision as to whether or not to do it?
Yes, absolutely. I tried everything that I could to try to get people onto that right position that I thought that we should be, where we should be, because of all the factors that were on play beyond us. And unfortunately, we couldn't get to that juncture. And as I said, it's not ideal, but it was the only way in which I could try to influence the decision.
Were you not part of the confusion by saying things, by making a statement one day and then doing a volte-face essentially the next, without there being any mature collective discussion around this by all ministers? Well,
with respect, I feel like it was mature. I felt like lives could be lost if we didn't take this decision. So I felt like that, having not been able to secure what I tried to secure within, then, and ultimately it would have come down to if we could have got agreement with the First Minister at the time and with the Education Minister and with Health, we could have presented that as this is the right approach. Unfortunately, we didn't have that support. Does my statement add to confusion? Yes, of course, perhaps you can absolutely say that. Do I believe it was the right thing to do? Yes, I do. Because I felt like we had lost people. People in that 24 hours were actively committing to remove their children from schools. Schools were shutting down, and as I said, even education authorities like CCMS were telling schools to close.
I'm going to move on and ask if we can deal with the position on the 16th of March. But can I, again, just coming back to your role as Deputy First Minister, you've just said that you were calling for this to save lives. if the position was grave enough on the 13th of March for you to be calling for school closures on the basis you've said to save lives, why was it not serious enough for you to be calling for civil contingencies arrangements to be stood up?
I think at that time we were moving towards standing up the civil contingencies, but I would divorce those two things with respect. I think that it's clear what I've said in terms of civil contingencies, that they could have been stood up sooner. Had they been stood up a week earlier or 2 weeks earlier, would that made a difference to the decisions that we were taking? Perhaps not. We don't know that. But in terms of the schools issue, I stand over the position that I took. I feel like it was the right position to take. I regret the circumstance in which it all unfolded, and quite frankly, it can be unedifying for an executive that was actually trying to do its best, because, as I said, I never doubted anybody's motivation around that executive table to try to do anything other than get us through this and get the public through it.
Well, perhaps we'll come back to what might have been thought to be a bit unedifying about the meeting that followed. But again, just so that we're clear on this, I mean, again, given that you've said that you did this to save lives, I'm just trying to understand why you would think you'd reached the position where you needed to go so far as to do this, but that even standing up the most basic of the civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland, that concern didn't warrant that. I'm just trying to understand how you reconcile those two things.
I'm in some ways I'm divorcing the two things. The schools issue just absolutely creeped up in terms of the announcement that schools were closing in the south of Ireland and what that meant then for public opinion. And we had to respond to that. I mean, this was a fast-paced, moving situation. Things were happening all around us. Different jurisdictions were taking different approaches, and the public were confused about that also. Whether that be north-south or east-west. I mean, I think we would have been served better by having a two-island approach to the pandemic, and perhaps as a lesson learned going forward, a two-island approach to a pandemic would, I think, serve us all much better, because it led to, that divergence led to complications then for how we would try to manage, even where the public were and understanding what was happening. And like at different times there would have been messages, for example, whenever the stay-at-home save lives message changed to stay alert, we didn't move to that position straight away. But our public here they watch BBC, they watch RTE, they're taking their news from two different channels that are, presenting a different message. It was confusing for our population, so we did try our best to navigate that, but at different times it was complicated.
Just in terms of how you navigated it, perhaps if we go to INQ 000 065 689, please. The inquiry has seen these minutes, Miss O'Neill, and again, if we just scroll down, please. I think again we can see it's the usual format where the Department of Health provides an update. And I think that we see you suggesting, I think if we carry on scrolling up, please. Yes, I think we saw reference to you saying that the executive, I think, had lost control 2 weeks ago. We can scroll back up if you didn't catch it.
I didn't catch it, sorry.
Could we go back to page 3, please? I may have my note wrong. I'll check that, Miss O'Neill, but I think that you do say that. We can come back to it. But I think if we move on to the proposal to consider the closure of schools, which was one of the things that was being discussed, and I think if we go forward, please, to page 10. Thank you. I think, Ms O'Neill, this is where we start to see consideration of the position in respect of schools. And I think we catch it at the midpoint where there's a blank line.
Yeah.
And then we see Ms Long saying that the executive always seems to be reacting, not leading. Did you agree with her, Ms O'Neill, that that was the position, given the role that the executive committee had had until then?
Yeah, I think that Naomi, myself, and we would have reflected the same sort of view at this stage. Now we're in the middle of March, that it was slightly frustrating that we weren't able to pull all the threads together that we would have wanted to have at that stage. So I think on this issue, and particularly what Naomi's referring to, is that it looks like we're behind the ball on schools, and that others are moving forward.
All right, I think if
I
we...
shouldn't speak for her, but I think that's what she
Yes.
acted.
But again, I mean, in terms of that collective responsibility, if the executive always seemed to be reacting and not leading, again, that was something for which you all bore responsibility. Do you agree?
Yes, of course I do. And I think if you scroll on down, I think I do comment, perhaps, in this conversation.
I think, well, we can pause maybe here. I think that we can see in the middle of that page the Minister for Finance interjects at this point.
Yes.
And we can see there he reflecting that there was a lack of confidence in Great Britain, setting out community concerns. And if we just go down, please. And I think that, again, if we just follow that thread, we can still see there's consideration of school closures, can't we?
Yeah.
Except because we can see from Department of Finance, except entirely it would be a long school closure. And the point being made that it was pointless to pretend it was only 2 weeks. And then I think that it adjourns. And then if we go, please, to page 17. We can see here, I think that this is the first time that the Executive Committee actually receives a briefing about civil contingencies. Do you agree?
Yes.
Why had no one been invited to the Executive Committee before the 16th of March
Again,
to explain and to enable you to exercise collective responsibility over what was being done?
So I think, and as I've said earlier, up until that point, it was health-led, and this was becoming more CCG-led.
Because we can see here, in terms of the planning, and he refers to the table being back at a table being at the back of the paper, and I think that may be the table to which you've referred. Departments can prepare own plans, but have to join up. And again, do you agree, Ms O'Neill, that, again, this just suggests an extraordinary lack of understanding as of the 16th of March, that of course a whole society approach and a cross-government approach was required and had been required for weeks by this stage.
Yes, and I'm not going to keep going over how I felt it was being dealt with prior to that, but yes, I think that's fair enough.
And I think if we go, please, to page 30. Again, I'm doing this because I don't want to be unfair to you, Ms O'Neill. I want to make sure that you can put this in some sort of context. I think this is the Minister for Education at the top, but perhaps if we can just scroll down. Yes. And if we could just scroll down, please. So again, just to draw attention to what you were saying there, that measures were confusing and misleading, told today that we're a week further on than we thought. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that a reflection to transmission in Northern Ireland
That's
being a
correct.
week further on? And if we just continue, please, to just scroll down. And then we come to the vote. So there was a vote, wasn't there, whether to close schools?
That's correct.
And then a vote, a counter vote, whether or not schools would close on the advice of the CMO.
Yes.
I mean, the point, Miss O'Neill, and the reason why I wanted to take you through that and to be fair about it is that on the 10th of March, we see, I'm not going to go back over it, we've agreed there's no thought given to what the ramifications would be for closing schools and what that might do to children. The concern, I think, seems to be the workforce implications, yes. Of course, serious in and of themselves. But when we come to this meeting, and I think that this is the only meeting that takes place in Northern Ireland at which the closure of schools is properly debated by the Executive Committee, that there doesn't appear to be any real consideration given to what this might do to children and the ramifications of closing schools. You can see the advice that had been given for 15 weeks might do. Do you agree with that?
So I would say in relation to that this was such a fast-moving situation, and the decision, and you can see some of the conversation reflects the implications for school closures, not just the workforce. It was children being able to take it home to grandparents, and it was all those other considerations. It was children with additional needs and what would happen to them. It was about those who are more vulnerable in society, those children that depended on free school meals. All those things were part of our conversations. But what we intended to do at this juncture was that this was still the school holiday period that we were in, St Patrick's Day holiday, and we hoped that would provide a wee small bit of a window in which for to allow a bit more preparation to be taken forward, particularly around our mitigation to be taken forward, particularly around the area of free school meals, where again I think this is one of the success stories, if you like, of how locally elected ministers were able to support children who needed their meals by working together. Both communities and education worked together to ensure that we also then were able to move on to put in school opening for children that needed to come into school for a varying category of reasons. So we moved to do the mitigation, but if you waited, you had all the mitigation in place throughout the pandemic, we wouldn't have taken the decisions when we did. I would suspect that would be the case now on this for sure. We knew there was going to be difficulties, but that's the scale of the decision that you were faced with. Do you keep the schools open, and what does that mean for vulnerable children? What does that mean for wider society? Or do you close them and try to suppress the virus and allow us a bit more time to be able to go off and put in place the mitigations that we all knew were going to be required? And of course, as became very clear the whole way through, we were never going to mitigate against the impact of a pandemic in totality. All we could do was try our best, and that's what I believe that we tried to do.
But in terms of those advocating, because there was a binary argument here, it was close or not close. And again, I just want to see if you agree with me. Well, first of all, that the closure of schools was probably one of the most significant steps that a government could take in response to a pandemic, yes?
Well, it was the first big decision that the executive took. Obviously, lockdown coming behind it was probably equally as significant in terms
Yes.
of what happened.
Of course, but I mean, the closure of, I just want to test this if I may. The closure, nothing like this had ever been done before, and you were contemplating taking children out of school for 15 weeks, yes?
That was what the Chief Medical Officer had advanced, that if we did move to school closures, that he suspected it would go to 15 weeks. But that being said, the flip side of all of this was that the virus was rapidly moving around, and we were trying to get on top of that, and also for the reasons that I've previously outlined, in particular the fact that parents had moved on and we had lost, I suppose, their confidence in terms of this issue. And I was trying to get us back onto that ground. So look, it wasn't easy. I accept that. And as I said, I clearly accepted the whole way through the pandemic that with the best will in the world, we weren't going to be able to impact in its totality, the devastation in the wake of a pandemic.
I think all of those points might be taken, but I think just coming back to the point, and as you rightly say, I think this is the first decision, in fact, that the Executive Committee were called upon to make in response to the pandemic. The first decision, it's whether to close schools. And there isn't any considered debate or discussion about the ramifications that might have for children in Northern Ireland and the impact that it might have on them.
And, we talked earlier about every department having its own autonomy and its own responsibility, in particular in terms of education, bringing forward mitigations, which, as I said, I referenced one example where education and communities work together. But yes, it was a huge, huge decision to take, and the first huge decision that we took as a collective executive. But this is the mechanism in which to get things onto the agenda of, this is how you conduct the business. You can bring forward proposals and we can vote accordingly, and that's why we did it in that way. We had the conversations, not just in that meeting. I can tell you that we had conversations with CMO and with health and with others in terms of trying to interrogate it for quite a considerable period of time in terms of where we were, and that's why we ended up where we did.
I'm sorry to come back to this, but do you agree there's no substantive discussion evident in this meeting about the implications for children or all of the counter effects that closing schools might have?
Well, I can accept that that there's no substantive discussion recorded in the minutes of this meeting, but I don't accept that that having closed schools, that we weren't immediately working to try to find the mitigations, which we did find. In terms of schools staying open for key workers, schools staying open for vulnerable children, all the different measures that we did bring forward. But this was real time. This was happening right in front of us, and we didn't have the luxury at this juncture, because of what had happened in terms of the school situation, where we'd lost parents' confidence in what we were trying to do. We had to move. But clearly, we accepted the outcome of the vote at that juncture to try to keep us on a collective response, but circumstances ran away from that juncture.
The counter vote that schools would close whenever the CMO advised, children were hardly well served by that either, were they?
No, because it's much more than just the advice of CMO. Of course, that's what guides us, but we had to take into account all those other wider societal factors, the deep inequality, the deprivation that exists across communities, the impact of closing schools, particularly for children that have domestic violence at home, the impact of closing schools on children with additional needs, the impact of closing schools for children that rely on their only hot meal in the day being in school.
Yes, but there wasn't really any discussion about any of those things.
But this was happening in live play.
Certainly. I shall return at 10 to 2.